The Age of Aquarius and Perspectives on the Historic Jupiter-Saturn Conjunction. Of course, I'm referring to the historic Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that occurred on winter solstice 2020, which just so happens to have occurred also at 0 degrees Aquarius. It's a very significant event, and many are interpreting it as the dawning of the Age of Aquarius. I do not, and I want to clarify why I don't in the course of this presentation. As well, I'll provide insights to you a bit about some background process that's been underway for the past few centuries linked to the discovery of planets which are linked to Aquarius. That's why I'm going to do that, and I'm going to keep it brief. But you'll get some insights about the workings of Western astrology in particular as we go along, so there'll be some interesting takeaways that way and how you can apply it to your own life. Now, so part 1, discoveries and synchronicities. Uranus, the planet that rules Aquarius, was discovered back in 1781, it being the modern ruler where the traditional ruler was Saturn. Some astrologers still work with Saturn as the traditional ruler, and it still applies, but it's much more forefront to refer to it as ruled by Uranus, which has an 84-year orbit, by the way. So the discovery of any planet, and there's been 4 since there was Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and Chiron, and in fact there's been a whole series more recently of planets beyond Pluto. They've still yet to be fully designated as where signs they co-rule, etc. So that's going to be fun and interesting to explore over the course of the coming years and decades among astrologers in particular in this respect, but we'll leave it for now and work with these 4. Now, the main thing is that each time one of these planets was rediscovered, let's say, there's ideas that the ancients knew about them, which is very interesting on its own ground, but they produce synchronistic outer expressions. For example, with Uranus, in about 1781, there was a lot of revolutionary activity going on linked to the American Revolution, actually the War of Independence, to be more exact, the War of Independence, where democracy, liberty, freedom from monarch rulership, etc., emerged, and a constitution in the United States became a real anchor point for the world, and it remains true to this day. And in fact, that's what is part of the political reality of our times, that the Constitution is at worst at stake with the rise of globalism, which is guided by a UN, but which is not itself guided by elected representatives. So the corruption and competition game in the world continues in full force, of course. Now, some of the key words for Uranus include invention, revolution, and democracy. Neptune was the next planet which was discovered back in 1846, the modern ruler of Pisces, where the traditional was Jupiter. 164.8-year orbit for Neptune discovered then. And at that time, along with the revolutionary impulse of Uranus, Neptune came along and was freed from the earlier imposition of science to lay claim to of authority on reality, on existence, with its scientific model, which is valid, but it no longer holds the same authority, in part due to the Uranian revolution and then the Neptunian. It brought forward new emphasis on mysticism and imagination, but also spirituality, and other key words are illusions and deceptions. Now, why those words are chosen in part is because of the subjectivity of perception and interpretation linked to paradigms and conditioning and individual nature. So even among learned people who have learned the same thing, there's invariably differences of interpretation and perspective and opinion. And this is where the notion of absolute truth or fact should be always questioned. Ironically, many people don't. And in some respects, they can be sort of categorized as sleeping because they are still under the illusion that they are seeing reality as it is. Until you awaken to realize that you do not, you see reality as you are, and your perceptions and interpretations are linked to your conditioning and your paradigm, your beliefs, your philosophy, then you're asleep. And then once you're aware of that, you're more humble, open, and able to entertain new considerations. So it's a very interesting fact. Even very intelligent, high IQ people can live under the illusion or self-deception of assuming they see reality as it is. And this is where the bias principle gets very, very high. It's rather unfortunate given the, tenor of the times and the repercussions of the conflicts that go on due to credulity, really, really strong assumptions that we're seeing reality as it is. So now Pluto, having a 248-year orbit, the modern co-ruler of Scorpio, so it really, Mars is the traditional ruler, but they both play an active forefront role as opposed to Jupiter and Saturn, which now play a more background role in terms of the rulership for Aquarius and Pisces. Now, discovered in 1930, it coincided with the nuclear age, the splitting of the atom. So the very deep power principle behind Pluto. It represents what power is in there or behind there. So wealth, control, and hidden power are some of the keywords linked to Pluto. And in some respects, this is where we get the idea of the plutocracy, the old oligarchy back there, still rather strongly pulling the strings in the world, the old wealth, the old family powers that be. So that's part of the game of the planet. It's probably going to continue, but it's just an interesting consideration that when with the rise of Scorpio and Pluto, especially energy, increasingly the bureaucracy grew immensely in the past, basically 100 years. The, tiers of bureaucracy has emerged where the true plutocrats kind of hide back there. And simultaneously, the corporation, the rise of that kind of power that's not linked to nations under a particular body of law, etc., has emerged as globalism, and many of those owners and shareholders are hidden. So they don't either represent very transparent powers. They're hidden. They pull the strings. This is the complexity of our times, and very much a theme that will remain active, I will suggest, in the Age of Aquarius. Now, Chiron, the more recent discovery of a very anomalous planet, which I'm going to explain why I say that in a moment, has a 50.4-year orbit. It's the modern co-ruler of Sagittarius, as it is a centaur, and so too is the symbol of the sign of Sagittarius, so it applies very well that way. And it was discovered on November 1st, 1977, and it coincided with holistic healing and medicine, which I'm going to explain a bit further. As we go into part 2 here, I'm looking at Saturn, Uranus, Chiron, and the time theme. So very briefly, Saturn, or Chronos, very traditionally represents chronological and linear time, and also linear thinking, very physics-based, very logical, linear, push-pull physics principles. It having a 29.5-year orbit is something that we'll get back to in a few minutes, why that can prove interesting. It's when you have your Saturn return, if there isn't what's called a triple return, which means that when Saturn returns, it retrogrades and then it stops, then advances forward again. So you have like a triple. And when people have that over a course of about a year, they have their Saturn return, where others will have it just over the course of a week. So it's a rather interesting difference. So the question you might ask yourself is, did I have a triple Saturn return, or when I was about in my late 20s, or will I when I'm in my late 50s, or my late 80s? That's the next one down. So some of you, fewer people, but there are those who might be interested in knowing their third Saturn return. So now, Saturn and horizontal thinking is a phrase I've come up with. It's part of the linearity of thinking that is linked to Saturn. It's very much linked to the scientific revolution in its early days. Things became very mathematical, very the aspiration to put things into very strong linear logical terms and to have absolute factual knowledge was a strong push, but it proved to be sort of broken, that whole objective, and that's the irony of it. They were seeking pure objectivity only to realize they couldn't. So the Uranus and Neptune revolution came along to deflect and, to dissolve that illusion. And that's where we get back to Neptune and illusions. Pluto then marched in and decided, okay, well, therefore, we'll take our power into the back rooms of the world where we can wield our authority. So while, democracy and constitutional law emerged, the old landed power no longer had the same responsibility, but still had a large both store and claim to that power. So that's part of the political reality of our times. Now, so there's Saturn. Now, Uranus, or Ouranos, its Greek ancient name, is linked to a more metaphysical model, as where Saturn's physics. Uranus would be metaphysics, and the key words or principles include dimensions, archetypes, and synchronicities. So that's interesting. What that's linked to is more holism and vertical thinking. Vertical thinking is linked to principles of like as above, so below, which in astrology is the main adage, where we recognize that the planetary alignments mirror as outer events here on Earth. So that's a beautiful ancient knowledge, and it's one that, again, throughout history has found popularity, and then due to powers that be has had to go underground, but has emerged again as the cycles of time unfold. And we're at one of those times where it's very popular again to appreciate that understanding. But it remains that many people have become rather, strong about science, not in a purely scientific sense, but more like in a religious sense, meaning they are unwilling to consider anything other than linear models of thinking, which applies fine in some areas of human inquiry and industry, even engineering, etc. But it philosophically no longer holds any real water. We've come to realize, and this is in part the Neptune factor, that all perception is, once again, as I mentioned, subjective, and how we are by our nature, by our destiny, by our soul level, by our conditioning, paradigm, philosophy, beliefs, all of these factors and others play a key role into bending our perceptions of experience, of reality. So it should be quite apparent to anybody in relationships that, we all don't agree. We all see things the way we are. So what reopened, what was shut down for a while, was philosophy and psychology's the rise of science in the mid 1700s and so forth, sort of thought there was no need for philosophy or anymore. So, because mathematics was factual and absolute, but no, because our interpretations and perceptions are more philosophical and more specifically psychological, but also what enters into that discussion is spiritual, psychological, philosophical, spiritual, whatever order you want to put them in. And in fact, it probably could go into the order of philosophical, psychological, spiritual. The traditional idea of spirituality is more of religion, belief, linked to a very core network of usually social authority, linked to the government, what would be called a theocracy, which has been true throughout history all over the world. But as that new democratic march of constitutional law, etc., emerged with Uranus, and then Neptune came in to support a more spiritual consciousness, and all of this is relatively new in history. So we're in this time of philosophy, psychology, and spirituality now, and that's entered a whole new level of interpretation. That's where we are right now. And Uranus, adding that metaphysical side, links itself to Neptune in light of a spiritual consciousness. In other words, considering that we are souls incarnate, which is an ancient knowing, but the scientific materialism emerged to denounce it. So it's still in many people's minds, untrue. It's not science, but they're holding ground that no longer is really quite valid because other revolutions have since emerged. So this is a good example of bias, which is quite everywhere. Now, Chiron and time anomalies is linked to also the principle that cycles, especially linked to planets, are never exact. Now, what I mean by that is the planets have very specific time periods for their orbits, but in a personal chart, you may have a Saturn return that occurs with a retrograde. That's why it is a triple return, and so it'll occur as early as 28, then or 28 and a half, and then there'll be it'll go forward for a while, having returned, then it will retrograde back over the point it was in your natal chart, then it will stop again and move forward. That's how retrogrades work. It's all from the Earth's perspective, but retrogrades have a very strong psychological impact, and social trends as well are influenced by them. So now the anomalies are referring more specifically to that, but also to when two planets form a conjunction and how their intervals work. And it's all linked also to the elliptical orbits of the planets. Okay, the planets each have elliptical orbits, which means that they're never moving. The planets do not move at the same rate of speed at any point. They're always accelerating or decelerating as they orbit the sun. Really important to note that in terms of the anomaly of timing linked to cycles. And I'm mentioning that in part for a lead up to what we're going to look at in a moment. Now, Chiron is very much linked to holistic healing in combination with Uranus. Now, what's really interesting about that is where Saturn is very linear and Uranus is very non-linear, or Saturn being horizontal, Uranus being vertical thinking. You get this real holistic model when you think with both of those. Chiron comes in and looks at the anomaly on one hand, but the very fact that Chiron's positioned between Saturn and Uranus plays a very key role here, because due to its elliptical orbit, sometimes for a very small period in its 50-year cycle, it comes closer to the Earth than Saturn. So that's so interesting that it does that. So it's a part of the highly elliptical eccentricity of Chiron that I'm attributing this principle of anomalies to. And it's just in part, it works as a, to explain the theme at least. Now, part 3, the great conjunctions of our times. Now, what we're going to do here is get more into the context. So what I want to do is create some bit of background in terms of this Age of Aquarius, some lead up realities, starting with Uranus and the discovery then of Neptune, Pluto, and Chiron, all of which have contributed to outer synchronicities of a whole new world, not simply subject to linear evolution. Okay, the push-pull of existence. Now, not everybody's quite aware of that. It's not something they think about, but there's a truth here, and I'll elaborate as we go along. So the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, all on its own, is linked to economic and social evolutionary eras. So the actual conjunction occurs about every 20 years, not exactly always at the same interval, once again, to the anomaly principle, that where Jupiter's 11.86 years in its cycle and Saturn's 29.5, due to where they are positioned in the signs, because that in each sign they'll have a different rate of speed, as mentioned, and due to their retrograde cycles, they can really come at form conjunctions at variabilities within about a year or so of time. And so now the social evolutionary eras are linked to the fact that the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions will occur in the same element over about 10 times in a row, with the interesting anomaly, that's why I mentioned it, of possibly occurring in another neighboring sign within that period, within the era period. So in this case, looking way back in 1384, there was a era of Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions in water signs, Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces, representing the water trinity in astrology. And there you'll see how it goes Cancer. Well, it starts right away with an anomaly of Aquarius, then it goes Cancer, Scorpio, Cancer, Pisces, Scorpio, Cancer, Pisces, Scorpio, Cancer, Pisces. What's interesting also is that the order of the signs is reversed. Cancer's, precedes Scorpio and Scorpio precedes Pisces, but the order in this case always goes in reverse order. That's interesting. That's an anomaly that you wouldn't necessarily expect. No, but the main point is that they occur in the whole period. That's why we refer to it as an era in water. Now I'll quickly go through and show you the next era is in fire, then the next era is in earth, and then the following era is in air. So it goes fire, earth, air, and then water again. Here on the bottom, where I'm showing you the beginning of the next cycle that begins again in fire. So it's very rhythmic, and it goes in earth, air, fire, and water, or more exactly, fire, earth, air, water, just like Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, fire, earth, air, water. So it works very much in alignment with the zodiac in the order of elements. Is rather interesting, despite the reversal of which signs come in the next order, right? So there's these little play on things. That's all part of the fun and interest of the astronomy of astrology. And astrologers look at these things more than astronomers because we're interested in the synchronicity factor. But there are those astronomers, I'm sure, who do that as well. So I'm going to go back very briefly just to go through it, so we don't have to do it for long. But this water trinity, 1384 to 1583, all water signs. And then the same thing with the fire trinity, Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. There was one anomaly of Pisces for one of those conjunctions, which therefore had a 20-year period. See, the seed event is the conjunction, and it acts as an anchoring principle for the entire 20-year cycle until the next cycle. Okay, so that's why the one we just had in December 21st, 2020 was so significant, because it was the anchor theme not only for the new 20-year cycle, but for the entire era. And moreover, it was at 0 Aquarius, and we're in the Age of Aquarius, which I'm going to elaborate upon further in a moment. So you really get this interesting takeaway with that understanding, and really appreciate how powerful this particular conjunction was, so you can even understand it more. And then the last era was in earth signs, beginning in 1802 with Virgo. Then we had two anomalies in that entire era period, one with Aries, one with Libra, as recent as 1980, but generally Virgo, Capricorn, Virgo, Taurus, Capricorn, Virgo, Taurus, Capricorn, etc. So that beautiful rhythmic order of things. And Aries would be otherwise have been Taurus, but it's the neighboring sign, and Libra would otherwise have been Virgo, but it's the neighboring sign, and that's where you get that anomaly between the two planets not occurring quite as rhythmically. I always want to wonder why that anomaly. What does it mean? Something, etc. And the answer is yes, invariably it does, but who's to say exactly what it means? So we'll leave that one alone for now. Now, the current era, again, there we are, began in 2020. It begins with Aquarius, and it goes Aquarius, Libra, Gemini, Aquarius, Libra, Gemini, Aquarius, Scorpio, instead of Libra, Gemini, and then Aquarius. So 4 times Aquarius. And you see the years they occur in, rather tidy in this case, 2020, 2040, 2060, 2080. 2100. You see that? So we can look way ahead and know, wow, we've really entered this air trinity, air sign principle era of Saturn Jupiter conjunctions linked to the economy and the social reality that surrounds that. So that's why we're entering such an interesting time with everything going on in the world, with the economic reset, etc. You begin to understand, wow, there's some patterns here. Now, I do want to bring attention to the fact that the Saturn-Pluto conjunction is a 34-year cycle. It's much shorter. It's not era-based. They don't occur in the same element in the same rhythmic way. I haven't done a big study on the rhythmic pattern, but it's not like that. And basically, it occurs every 34 years and is very strongly linked to the economy. The very fact that there was one that coincided, for example, the most recent occurred on January 12th, 2020, and the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction occurred, of course, on December 21st, 2020. So they occurred within quite close proximity, as you can imagine, because the Jupiter-Saturn's every 20 years and this one's every 34 or 35 years. So it takes quite some time before they align in close proximity. So this is very close, and that's why by synchronicity we're having such a major social economic reset principle play out. So when we look at the world stage, we see all the drama, all the opposition, all the competition, all the corruption, all the propaganda, etc. It's just a real battle for, power, etc. But it also is linked to the natural flow of destiny, linked to synchronicity. When you really get deep into the understanding of destiny and synchronicity, you kind of get this notion of the divine plan. Some may not like that, but it's too bad. They're stuck in linear, rational Saturn mind. They can't appreciate the other dimensionality of existence, which is very Uranian. So I want to encourage you to be aware of that from an archetypal perspective. Now, the next one, we're going to jump to a different perspective here really quickly, which is to see a bigger, wider encompassing cycle of the far planets. And this is going to drive home to a more clear understanding of context on one hand, but to the Age of Aquarius principle, which I want to share with you. So the Neptune conjunct Pluto cycle is about every 500 years. Imagine that. Now, the current cycle began on April 30th, 1982. It just so happens, it's a really interesting, it does have an era principle, but it's a very long era of approximately, 9,000 years or something. No, it's not that long. It's about 4,500 years or so. Now, the main thing is each time a conjunction occurs, it occurs in the same sign. That's the interesting thing. So where Jupiter-Saturn remains in the same element, but changes signs every 20 years, but still the element principle is strong for about 220 years, creating an era. The the Neptune-Pluto conjunction, it occurs in the same sign 9 or 10 times in a row. Each one being 500 years. So it's like more of like an epoch, I suppose, or one could just describe it as a very, very long era of that principle playing a background role. Now, admittedly, every time those two far planets do form a conjunction, they do so in a different degree of that sign, and it brings forward a certain principle. Now, without getting too lost in deep analysis of the chart, but one could, and historians especially, all of this kind of thinking could be really great for historians or climatologists or people who watch long-term trends in any form, and fashion economic as well. They might be interested in this kind of knowledge. But the main thing is this particular Mayan astrology short interpretation from the dream spell, written by, the particular interpretations written by Jose Arguelles, by the way, who's deceased some years ago, the wonderful genius mind who helped bridge Mayan astrology to Western astrology, who was ridiculed for it, but did something very creative and brilliant. And it really works wonderfully. He knew that if he didn't, practically that the Mayan astrology would have basically been lost to time. So he really effectively, brilliantly hooked the Mayan astrology to the Western astrology with recognition of its adaptability. That's one of the reasons. We won't go into a long discussion of that, but basically that's the reason in part. He also wanted to introduce the paradigm, the philosophy of the Mayan to the Western world because he felt that it holds a great contribution for us all in the time to come. And having studied it, I will agree, especially because its language is more galactic, cosmic, spiritual, dimensional than even Western astrology. So it's done a great service. I just wanted to add that very quickly. So the date, specifically, I'm looking at that April 30th, 1892. Have a look yourself, but I really like that it reads as Yellow Galactic Human, and the poem reads, I harmonize in order to influence modeling wisdom. I seal the process of free will with the galactic tone of integrity. I'm guided by the power of intelligence. And it's a galactic activation portal day. You could go into reading that, but it just represents a very powerful day, not a big surprise. But I like this discussion of I seal the process of free will, given the rise of communism on the world, which is not about free will, which is all about control. It goes against that principle. And communism and materialism are very closely related, as I understand it, and they're invariably antichrist. They're against spiritual. So that's my strong opinion about that. And this galactic tone of integrity implies the need or the objective of us being in alignment with our spiritual nature, our cosmic spiritual nature. And again, Mayan astrology does a brilliant job of revealing that. So I interpret it as very much playing a surprise role. That's very Aquarius. The unexpected is a principle linked to Uranus and Aquarius. But Mayan astrology has come along and has been kind of adjoined, shall we say, like a backpack, if you like, put onto Western astrology, and it's in its own system called the dream spell, which I find very accurate in my work, as do other astrologer friends I know. Now, it has a destiny purpose, basically. There's a much longer interpretation. I'm not going to get into it right now, but it really does merit some attention if one were really wanting to understand it. But basically, its destiny purpose is the alchemical transmutation that turns baser materials into gold. Very beautiful. What that translates to mean even more than that is the personal self-transformation consciousness linked to raising one's vibration and all of this notion of ascension, which has a very strong appeal to the world at this time, linked to the entire notion of spirituality, dimensionality, and so forth. So that's the gist of it. Basically, those of you who are into it know what I'm talking about, but those of you who don't, well, here's your introduction. Here's your cue. Now, the core challenge of this cycle is to achieve the balance between a conscious realization of connection to source and the awareness of the co-creative purpose of life in the Earth School. Now, it's a bit of my paraphrase, admittedly. What it means is that it's one thing to be aware of a higher power and source, that we're souls incarnate, that there's a God, if you like, a higher intelligence, which has intention, purpose, creativity, and intentionality, etc., and that so do we. But part of that is that in our incarnation here, we're here to learn through the earth experience, to become masters of many levels of human experience, so that we can thereby eventually graduate and enter into a larger participation with existence, which invariably means participation in higher dimensions of reality. Okay, so it's really important to understand the purpose for us all generally, but this one is linked directly to the co-creation principle. We don't just create our destiny, we co-create. Okay, anybody who says that's just Hollywood nonsense to me, that, you don't just create your reality, you co-create. Okay, so it's close, but with a notion of co-creation comes a principle of cooperation, respect, more of a humility, if you like. It's not an ego trip, and that's part of the issue at worst of some of the baser or more infantile principles linked to Aquarius, by the way. Now, the main theme behind this very major important conjunction background player of Pluto and Neptune forming a really important background cycle is the themes of human versus nature, which we are certainly seeing, or humanity and nature, which is an important principle in the world that is trying to gain prominence, and for good reason, but how it gains prominence is the next question. If it does so outside of a democratic, constitutional based law structure for the planet, it won't go very well. It will be totalitarianism, justified tyranny. With a constitution, it will level the playing field, and it will still awaken people, and most people would generally agree that we need to think and act in our world in a much more responsible manner regarding the environment and the ecology, and how, how we pollute, and how we can, politically, economically organize ourselves so that we don't plunder the planet, and so forth, however you want to describe it. So it's where the two poles, right and left, shall we say, both have merit. So what's the middle ground? And I think the answer is, what we need is a very solid upholding of a constitution, as with the one in the United States, which is probably the most powerful and profound in the world, and it get applied to a notion of a UN based on elections. Currently, elected officials of the UN, as I understand it, are appointed. And that's not good. That's a form of tyranny, because we're not voting. Who are they? Did we agree? Are they the best people? Etc. This kind of thinking, this freedom of speech and democracy, is an important theme of the Age of Aquarius, and it goes back to the discovery of Uranus. So now you're beginning to understand why I've created this contextual perspective. So it weaves in a lot of levels of consideration, and I'll continue. So now Uranus conjunct Pluto, it does so every 140 years, and it plays a significant role. And I didn't want to get too much into it right now, but I did create a video on it, the Uranus-Pluto conjunction and the gender revolution, which you can find on my YouTube channel. And it comes in two parts. Basically, though, it represents a gender revolution, but also social and economic equality and new norms in sexual expression, in whatever manner those will come about. But it's just a more liberal, on the high side of it, perspective, but also one which changes our usual assumptions and or notions of ethics and what's proper, what's not, etc. So it's playing a very important role in the background as well. And the current cycle began in 1965 and ends in 2104. So some children being born today will experience that as old people, of course. But you never know, by then we might be living longer lives. But the way things are going, it's hard to bet on that right now. But in any case, Saturn conjunct Uranus now is another important cycle. It has a 55-year cycle approximately, due to the elliptical orbits making it anomalous in terms of exactly at what intervals. They're close, but never quite the same. That's the key thing to understand in terms of the anomaly. Now, the fact that the most recent one occurred in February of 1988, and most importantly at the 29th degree of Sagittarius. In astrology, the 12 signs, the zodiac, the circle is divided by 12, which equals 30 degrees. So there can never be a planet more than that 30 degrees. So if you find that there's one at 29, it represents a critical degree, and 29 degrees are principles of overcoming. I'm going to get back to why this is important for us right now in 2020 as we head into 2021. It's very, very significant, and basically it's because Saturn will arrive at its last 90-degree angle to Uranus. It's what's called a synodic cycle, because although they form a conjunction at a certain degree, that slower planet keeps moving. That's what they call the synodic cycle. So it draws it out. It's otherwise, if it was just fixed, it would be very much the exact year interval of Saturn, which is 29.5, about to return back to the point it was. Some may look at that, and it may be something to look at among some astrologers, but generally we look at what's called the synodic cycle. We want to see when, due to both planets moving, they'll form their next conjunction. Okay, so now the main point though is, even so, the day it occurs, the exact moment of exactitude, we can cast a chart, and that chart becomes the seed event, and we can study that chart to know in a prediction forecasting sense what will happen over the course, or what its core influence is. And each one, merits quite some, amount of, let's say, knowledge. You could write a little book for each conjunction, and they're happening, quite often with the faster moving planets, but the slow planets, as you can see, it's not that often at all. Neptune, Pluto every 500 years. Saturn, Uranus every 55 years. Saturn, Pluto every 35 years about. And we're going to get close to the Uranus, Neptune, which is about 170 years. So, but before we do that, first, let's have a quick look at the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, which is about 47 years, and the current one began in 1989 at 11 Capricorn 54. Okay, so that's interesting. Now, why that's interesting is linked to the recent, or what I'm interpreting to be the actual dawning point of the Age of Aquarius, which I'm going to explain momentarily. But first, so that occurred in 1988. The Saturn Uranus in 88, the Saturn Neptune in 89, and then Uranus Neptune in 1993. Now, there's years between them, but in light of the far planets being in such close proximity over a period of time, this was very significant. They formed, in effect, a triple conjunction, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. So, but basically, Uranus conjunct Neptune is a 170-year cycle. The current one did occur on February 2nd, 1993, in terms of its exactitude, but admittedly, there was more than one conjunction. We're not going to get into that, but the cycle actually begins at the first conjunction, but due to retrograde, there can be more than one conjunction, and those do matter, but we're not getting into that right now. At the time, there was other planets in Aquarius. The Sun, Saturn, Mercury were conjunct in Aquarius, and Jupiter was in what's called the decant of Aquarius in the sign of Libra. A lot of Aquarian factors. So let me show you something about this right now. Okay, I have just switched from the slide presentation to the actual computer program I have for looking at charts. Now, what you're looking at here is the Saturn-Uranus conjunction. This is Uranus, this is Saturn at 29, Sag 55. You see that? If you look very closely, there's 29. That's the symbol of Sag at 55, Uranus and Saturn. That occurred on February 13th, 1988. Now, what I want to show you is a span of about a dozen years or so, which is a very significant time period during which I believe gave rise to the Age of Aquarius technically, but it does not dismiss the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that occurred just recently in 2020 on winter solstice. No, it though represents the next major installment of the Age of Aquarius, and so we'll get to that in a moment. But watch this. I'm going to animate this chart. What that means is I'm going to move it forward by each moment will be first we're going to start with weeks, and then we're going to go, well, actually, I think we're going to start with months. Every click will be 1 month forward. You're going to watch the moon jump, and all the other planets are going to move. So you're going to get a sense. As a matter of fact, I'm going to start with weeks. As I say that, I'm going to start with weeks so that you can get an idea. Watch this. Watch the moon move at intervals. It's moving about every quarter up here. It'll move down to here. It's It's moving, in about 1 week, it moves in its a quarter of its cycle. Now, what you're noticing is bit by bit over time, all the planets are moving. But what you want to see here is Uranus, Neptune, and Saturn all very, very closely huddled, a very rare triple alignment of those far planets. Now, what we have done in this chart, by the way, is anchored Neptune to the ascendant. You can do that by setting. By the way, with your birth chart, you have an ascendant, whatever it may be. You may even have a planet there, but you can look at your chart from any planet as the anchor planet on the ascendant, and you can get a whole different perspective of yourself from the angle of that planet. So it's a bit of a digression to what we're talking about, but I wanted to mention it. Now, so I've been showing you basically, by this time it's December into early January 1989. We've gone 1 week intervals, and you see how the planets back here are moving, and see how the aspects change. Astrology is very alive, very dynamic. There's nothing static about it. The chart of your birth seems static, but it's representative of a very, very dynamic process of all the planets always moving at different, rate, both at always at a different rate of speed in their acceleration, deceleration, but also when they, due to the combination of all the planets, when they form conjunctions, when they form these aspects and begin new cycles, is always different. In fact, the chart as a whole is never the same ever twice. That's a really important little takeaway. Now, already we're into 1989. There's been a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. See that? So we've been the whole time just going by week intervals, but week at a time with each click. But look how close Uranus, Neptune, and Saturn are. And because of their retrograding, Saturn tends to move faster, of course. So it's gone forward, and all the faster moving planets come along and also form powerful conjunctions with them all. But once they move on a bit, watch what'll happen. They're all still together. And the date by now is, we started at in early 1988. Now we're into 1990, and those 3 planets are very closely aligned. So this is where I interpreted it as representing the Age of Aquarius, but this is the beginning. It's the prelude. Here I'll show you. I'm going to go month intervals at a time, as I said I would a few minutes ago. So what we're looking for here on the left, that 9 o'clock position on the clock, is Uranus conjuncting Neptune. So you see with each click, we're moving 1 month ahead. So you'll watch the moon make these big jumps. In fact, the moon is showing it just as a small interval, but it's doing an entire circle and going a bit further ahead, because the moon cycle is 27.8 or about 27.5 degrees, where the 1 month cycle is 30. So it's arriving ahead of what it was, but a complete lap ahead. Okay, so the main point here is that Uranus is about to form a conjunction with Neptune. It will take until 1993. We're now in 1992. You see, Saturn by this time has moved on, and it has entered, in fact, the Age of Aquarius. But the Uranus-Neptune are about to form a conjunction, which they do in 1993. See them both at 20 degrees. Now, I'm not going to try and adjust the time to show you the exact date. We don't have to worry about that. The main point is, you know that this very rare 170-year alignment happens in the sign of Capricorn, which represents the old establishment, the old guard, and Uranus-Neptune represents the destruction of the old. But what also is significant, so there they are, formed their conjunction, and earlier I showed you Saturn for many months, in fact a couple of years, 3 years even, was very, very closely aligned with both of them, forming conjunctions with both of them, until they themselves finally formed their own conjunction. So had this triple far planet conjunction. Wow, that's quite rare, quite significant. Now I'm going to move intervals ahead, and what I'm going to show you is how they maintain. By this time we're in 1994. Neptune and Uranus are maintaining very, very close proximity to each other, but by a certain point here, Uranus at this time has entered Aquarius, very closely coinciding with Sun and Mars as well at that particular time. And if we went back in the intervals of weeks, which I'm about to do here, we will see other planets join in. You see there that particular week was January 9th, 1996. You had 3 planets in Aquarius. Uranus hadn't quite arrived, but one click later and it's there. So those faster moving Mercury, Venus, Mars, etc. are significant enough, but it's the far planets, as I keep saying, that's really matters. But what we're seeing is by 1996, so in the early 90s, Uranus itself entered Aquarius. Uranus rules Aquarius, okay? And it's a far planet, so it can only arrive every 84 years, where Jupiter and Saturn, well, they formed a conjunction in Aquarius, which is very significant, no less at 0 degrees. So it's very important. But here we'll continue and I'll show you. So over the coming time period, we're going to look and we're going to see how Uranus enters Aquarius. Then it actually goes back into Capricorn a bit. Then Neptune does the same thing. It's going to enter Aquarius and then it's going to go back a bit due to its interval. Then it goes back into Aquarius where it will remain. So there we go. Uranus and Neptune in Aquarius by 1990. So in the 90s is when we had the real age of Aquarius begin. But what's the most significant principle that I didn't quite mention is this, that when the exact conjunction occurred, okay, in the first place, the original Uranus Saturn conjunction first, and then the more specifically in 1993, what amounted to, I'm going to advance it by years at this point, by 1993, we had a Uranus-Neptune conjunction. That year, when that exact conjunction occurred, the internet went public. Okay, so while there was computers all the way back, even as early as the 50s, the World Wide Web as public domain occurred technically in April of 1993. And that is what gave rise, in my view, to the Age of Aquarius. So here we are again, just to wrap things up. The Uranus-Neptune conjunction is a 170-year cycle. The current one began on February 2nd, 1993 at 19 Capricorn 33. And there was a lot of Aquarian influences along the way to support this perspective as well. So that's interesting. But now from the Mayan, there's a little poem, and I thought I would add it here for that date. White solar dog, I pulse in order to love, realizing loyalty. I seal the process of heart with the solar tone of intention. I'm guided by the power of death, or what would be transformation. So it's really important that it really represents a strong spiritual theme of this whole principle of love, heart, loyalty, and the principle of co-creation linked to intention. The destiny purpose reads as calling in and recognition of other companions of destiny. Now, look at the internet and the social media and all that, how it's changed the way people relate, and there's networks created that way. But also, it has a metaphysical side, and it goes on to support others who see and acknowledge your authenticity, so new alliances across time and space. And it's not just your neighbors anymore, it's people all over the world who you align with, and you don't align so closely with those close nearby. That's the new shift among others. And also it includes other beings or spiritual beings, whether guides, and other angels and other dimensional beings, by the way. Now, the core challenge is the challenge to be aware of and remain connected to our own nature. I like that because it flies in the face of the downside of the Pluto-Neptune conjunction, which has this notion of control over nature, which I generally interpret as, AI and transhumanism, merging people with machines. It's against our nature, I would offer myself. Some may argue that, but I'm going to maintain that position. And I think it's the challenge of our times to be aware that while we may try these things, we must be aware of the dangers of them and, see through them. Just because we can, it doesn't mean we should. In terms of the dignity of our spiritual nature, and that's the key message there. So now the World Wide Web and the dawning of the Age of Aquarius, I'm asserting it began in 1993. And it's interesting to note that the World Wide Web became public that year, and the www is very much like the glyph of Aquarius. So that helps as well to give consideration. So returning back full circle now, I've provided you with a rather full, rich, elaborated, contextual background to this historic winter solstice that occurred here just recently in 2020. This Jupiter-Saturn conjunction at 0 Aquarius. So it most certainly represents a major installment. So this is what I'll offer as a consideration. If we were measuring the 2160-year age, which is what an age is on average, if you divide what's called a great year, are the 12 ages of the zodiac, which is about 26,000 years. It's also known as a precessional cycle, by the way, which is another conversation we'll leave for now, but it's a precessional cycle. But the main thing to understand is that the each age, or 1/12 of the great cycle, the really big one, is about 2160 years. Now, if we were to compare that to one day, then the crack of dawn, the dawning of the Age of Aquarius, if we were to equal that as 6 a.m., where we are now in 2020 is 6:15 a.m. So even though it's been 27 years since that particular, and then some months since that conjunction of Neptune and Uranus, to really officially anchor the key moment where the old was ended and the new began, is that we're only 15 minutes into the day. So the metaphor carries on that this particular Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is when the caffeine kicks in. We're awake at 6. You get your hot beverage, usually caffeinated, not always, but generally, if you know what I mean. And, or we can metaphorically say the rocket hits the atmosphere. So the blast off was in 93. It officially began, but now the rocket is clearing the atmosphere. And it's true that a new Jupiter-Saturn era has begun. So it very much is worth bringing forward as a very significant installment of the Age of Aquarius. And it's really, if the rocket going to the moon, say, it really clearing the atmosphere is where it really begins to, travel through space and enters that new domain. And that can very much be paralleled to the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction we just had here in 2020. So a funny little play on things is, by the way, the Age of Capricorn is 2130 years away, therefore, or will occur in the year 4150. Wow. So it gives you a little perspective on, wow, we have just entered the Age of Aquarius, and now you have an idea of just how long it is, and we're really at the very early stages of it, and we're really scrapping it out really here on the earth plane to decipher who will have the power, how will it go. I don't think this particular time in history is going to decide the entire age. There'll be other revolutionary periods of one kind or another, but it is a very significant time where we establish the groundwork of the entire era and age all together. So it is significant indeed. So now, over the course of the Age of Aquarius, there'll be approximately 10 eras, by the way, of Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions, each constituting about 200 to 220 years. So this one, very significant at 0 Aquarius, but by no means the only one, and that's how many eras will be encompassed of Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions in this Age of Aquarius. Now, we're going to tail this off with the understanding that the Saturn conjunct Uranus did occur back in 1988, but that cycle is not over yet. The next one's in about 2032, And in the meantime, in 2021, we're going to have 3 exact squares from Saturn to Uranus over the period of the year, encompassing the entire year. And when you have square aspects, are very edgy, very tensional. They can be the themes are at cross purposes. Where Saturn's in revolutionary Aquarius, Uranus is in fixed Taurus. The fact that they're both fixed signs adds to the gravity. You might say there's cardinal, fixed, and mutable signs in astrology, and they're called modalities. The fixed, you could say, have the most gravity. Okay, so it's very significant to note that. So these squares that are going to arise over the course of 2021 is very significant. It represents a very major turning point of a revolutionary sort. It will not be a calm and peaceful year by any means. The whole drama of COVID-19 won't just simply go away, but what it will give rise to, especially with the Aquarian factor due to Jupiter and Saturn, is a revolutionary appeal. So whatever is going to happen won't go easily. It's not where last year there was a lot of Capricorn authority lockdown and just, really the government locking everything down. The revolution, I must admit, is about to begin, and it'll begin early in 2021. Now, I am going to do a larger presentation for what's called the horoscope for the year for my members, I must admit. So if you want to have access to that, you have to be a member. Membership doesn't cost a lot. It's only $4.99 a month. And with that, you get a lot of little bonuses, one of which is 15% discounts on all readings. That really quickly adds up, by the way. So it doesn't take long before you've paid for it and you get all the bonus information, which I provide every week and through my weekly horoscope. I offer a free weekly horoscope, which is short, hardly a tip of the week, and the longer one has about a whole page each week of rather rich insight about what's going on. So if you really want to be in tune that way, it's the way to go. And as well, I do a monthly forecast and the prolonged and in-depth horoscope for the year, both as a written version and more elaborately as a video presentation with full graphic imagery. So I invite you to take part in enjoying that, and the horoscope for the year will actually come in 2 parts. I do that where the first part comes at the end of the year and the second at the time of summer solstice. Okay, so yeah, a really rich, wonderful video to get a lot of insights about, some of which I've hinted at here, but we'll elaborate much more fully on the year to come, 2021. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope you got some good takeaways here. And visit my website to see more of my services, and you'll also see in the library there some links to videos that you could enjoy, some of which are free, others of which are reserved for members. So thanks again for your time, and all the best in 2021.